What I'm going to do today is talk about gender and the crisis. What does the crisis mean in relationship to gender? How should we be thinking about it? This is both an issue of the significance of crisis for the whole of what? Europe and beyond, because of the significance of the European Union, and also the significance of the crisis for gender relations. So, thank you for the invitation and for the conference. So, what does crisis mean? What does it mean for the EU? What is austerity? And what are the implications of this for how we think about change? The European nightmare is that this is a repeat of the 1930s. The financial crash of 1929, the Great Depression in the 1930s, the exacerbation of ethno-nationalism, fascism, Holocaust, World War. Are we descending into this all over again? I think that's our really big question. And then, what is the EU? What is it for? Like many of my European colleagues, I think of Europe as a peace project. The European Union was founded in order that never war again in Europe. But what's it become? Some of my academic colleagues say it's become a neoliberal machine. That's streak. Or is it still the most important polity for gender equality in the world? What is it? Is it descending into fascism again? Is it a neoliberal machine? Or does it still have the possibility of being the most significant polity in the world for gender equality? And in this context of the crisis, we have alternative trajectories. The one that most talk about is that of fragmentation and disintegration. But there is another project still sitting there. Last summer, when we were discussing the Greek crisis, the 5 presidents of the European Union brought out a report on completing Europe's economic and monetary union. The project to ever deeper union is still alive in the European Union. We have both possibility of fragmentation and deeper union. In relationship to gender, what should we think about the European Union? The European Union has delivered equal treatment in employment, delivering equal pay for work of equal value. It's extended its concept of equality in employment to issues of pensions. It's extended that notion of equality all the way through, including to civil partnerships for same-sex unions, that they should be able to inherit pensions. Extremely broad conception of the materiality of equality led through the equal treatment clauses in the European Union. At a political level, we've got notions of gender mainstreaming, the development of the equality architecture with which we worked on Quing. What does it mean for the different intersections of different kinds of inequalities? In relationship to violence, we've seen the very recent extension since the Treaty of Lisbon of the area of freedom, security and justice, and the inclusion of issues of violence against women, gender-based violence, within that concept. And we have seen at an EU level the development of domestic protection orders working across the whole of Europe, not simply matters of individual member states. And potentially, we had the notion of embedding democracy and human rights in development policy. Potentially. Enormous potential. But what do we have? A cascading crisis, or never again. I think of the crisis as cascading. It's not just once. It's not just one moment. The financial crisis in 2007 is still having an impact. And what I'm going to do today is to discuss how the crisis has cascaded from finance to the real economy of employment, to the fiscal, which means budgets for the welfare state, into violence and a political crisis. and show how each of those stages of the crisis is gendered, and each of them is a system in its own right, for which we need an understanding and a re-theorisation of society in order to be able to both make sense of the world and potentially to intervene in it. So the crisis has been cascading from one zone to another, and it has affected the nature of the gender regime. This isn't a simple notion of, is there more or less gender equality? The concept of gender regime is attempting to get more deeply at the nuances of the different forms of gender relations. A gender regime is a system of gender relations. It's not just simply the relations between men and women. It's the notion that these different systems can take different patterns, have different forms, have different ways in which the different parts are interconnected. They create then different kinds of inequality. And we have seen in the analysis of the crisis different ways in which people have been understanding the changes in the forms of these gender relations. This is a quick summary of 4 ways of thinking about this. One way of thinking about the gender regime was to think about the extent to which men were the male breadwinner and women were the carers. Simple but important notion. This is similar to, but not the same as, that notion that we have production and reproduction. That women are more often in reproduction and men more often in production, and that the crisis will give us a movement between production and reproduction, and some have claimed that we have a move towards reproduction and away from production. We have other theories, like Connell's work on gender orders, but in the way that I want to theorise the gender regime is more complex than simply the notions of production and reproduction. I'm wanting to theorise this in a more complex way in order to be able to capture the nature of the changes which are going on. So rather than it being simply a movement of women between home and work, which is the traditional way of thinking of how crises, recessions, high levels of unemployment affect gender relations, I want to argue instead that the crisis hasn't, in most of Europe, pushed women back into the home. There have been attempts, but typically that isn't what has happened. But rather, we have seen the greater exploitation of women within the public gender regime, and that the public gender regime has become more neoliberal and less social democratic. So I'm going to provide a discussion of the nuances of the changes in the forms of gender system. So it's not just that the crisis creates more inequality, it changes the nature of those gender relations in complex ways as we see the change in the form of the gender regime. So I'm going to argue that this isn't a refamiliarisation, but rather a neoliberalisation of the public gender regime. And this has implications for how we think about the development of policies and politics in this area. I'm also going to argue that we have seen very significant feminist contestations, but that these are often underestimated. That we have seen an invisibilisation of the extent to which feminists have been active in contesting these changes. And I want to again engage with the why have the feminist responses not being seen, not been made as visible, and not been analysed as much as they should be. So I want to engage with those feminist contestations. So I'm now going to go through the crisis in its stages and pick up those theoretical arguments as we go through. But first, I'm going to say, what is a crisis? Is a crisis obvious? I'm saying it's got these stages. Is a crisis just ending up in catastrophe? Or are crises actually quite normal in a capitalist society? We always have small-scale economic problems, business cycles. There's always a question of up and down of the economy, small-scale crises. We also have notions that crises are times of major restructuring. We have traditional writers like Schumpeter arguing that the crisis is a time of major restructuring of an economy. It's a time when the old is collapsed and the new has an opportunity to grow. Some of that is very optimistic, the notion of that restructuring of the economy. Most optimistic of all is probably Polanyi, who imagines that when there is a big crisis over the over-commercialisation of land, labour and money, civil society will come back and will rescue us all and will, in this double movement, restructure in a positive direction. So that notion of crisis already has different kinds of elements in it. Small scale of self-equilibrating crises, where things go back to normal quite quickly, really big structural changes, or catastrophe. I use complexity thinking within social science in order to attempt to theorise some of these ways of thinking about social change. What this means is that I don't think that there is proportionality between an event and its consequences. There is a non-linearity. Small changes can have very big effects. And I'm drawing upon a particular way of thinking about the social system through complexity theory in order to provide an account of that. So, different stages of the crisis. What's finance? Were you like me and thought finance was not very important in 2006? And then in 2007 we all realised we needed to know what it was. Was finance just simply a neutral way of distributing capital? We could leave the financiers to get on with it. Or is capital extremely important in shaping the structure of our economy? Is finance really part of capitalism? Or, further, is finance open to regulation? So is it something which can be understood as just the free hand of the market, follow Hayek and Friedman? Do you go with the analyses which argue that finance is capital? Or do you, like me, regret having not read Keynes and Minsky when you're a youth and turn in later life to reading the analyses of the significance of finance within our overall economy and the significance of the forms of control which are open to democratic societies that seek to regulate finance properly, as we did after 1929 at Bretton Woods. So, finance can be a site of political struggle over the extent to which is regulated in the interests of the wider society, or the extent to which it's part of global capital. And that governance of finance is gendered. There are two ways of thinking about that. One is to think about finance as a finance company. Those small, all-male groups engaged in groupthink that took these excessive risks. Or we can think of the management of finance as something you would expect normal government to do as part of its normal regulation of the economy. and that's gendered. Those all-male groups were high-risk groups. If we had seen women on those financial corporate boards, would we have had less risk-taking? Or is this also a question as to whether feminists understood finance enough so as to make it part of an analysis of the economy? Because of the detrimental effects that finance would have, is this part of a women's studies curriculum yet? Okay. So what went wrong with finance? It was badly regulated. Anybody from Stiglitz to the IMF to the Bank of England suggests that what went wrong was the failure to regulate. The failure to regulate finance caused major problems in the real economy, as you well know. Massive reductions in the output and the employment. Those changes in employment were uneven in their gendered effects. In some countries, in some places, they particularly affected women. In others, at the start, they affected men. Different phases in different countries were very different as a consequence of gendered occupational and industrial segregation. So we saw very significant differences in the extent to which women and men lost their jobs. The British data. The different phases of the recession had different implications. The early phases were typically met by a Keynesian response. The second response was typically one of austerity. So I want to move on to a feminist analysis of the fiscal. The fiscal is the orthodox name for spending on the welfare state. So if I translate this into gender speak, we're talking about spending on the welfare state. We're talking about childcare, elder care, education, healthcare. The orthodoxy calls this fiscal. It's about how much money does the government bring in taxation and how much money does it spend, especially on the welfare state. And after that financial and economic crisis, we were considered to have a fiscal crisis. Considered to have. This is highly disputed. And where did it come from? The arguments in Britain were whether it came from overspending on welfare. Welfare was the cause. Even the IMF thinks that was wrong, and that the fiscal problem, was a result of the financial crisis. So was the fiscal crisis real, or was it politically invented? There was clearly an issue of some deficits, but were they really enough to mean that we should have had such enormous cuts in the welfare state? Or was the crisis taken as a state of emergency to justify, without full democratic control, major cuts in welfare expenditure? Do we have the narration of the crisis as a state of exception which could legitimate major changes in expenditure on welfare as a consequence of the creation of a fiscal crisis? So we saw a shift of emphasis from finance to fiscal. And I spent so much time on the finance because I want to pull us back to finance. So what could we have done? You can tolerate a deficit. By historic standards, it wasn't very high. Britain's highest deficits had been after the Napoleonic Wars. It was several times higher. Deficits can be tolerated, especially at times of low interest rates. But in 2010, the interest rates were very high. So what else could have been done? We could have collected taxes. Close down those tax havens. A tax on the finance sector, financial transactions tax, Tobin tax. All the member states apart from the EU wanted to have a financial transactions tax. You will have your opportunity. So, what did they do? They cut expenditure. The expenditure cuts were disproportionately gendered. The UK has particular evidence on this as a consequence of Women's Budget Group activities, House of Commons Library analysis, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We have very detailed analyses of the extent to which the cuts in the benefits and the welfare state disproportionately affected women. 72% of the initial round of cuts in 2010 were borne by women, 28% by men. Violence. Andrew mentioned the work I do on violence. The cuts took place at a national level. Most of the services to protect against interpersonal violence, violence against women, domestic violence, rape, take place at a local level. Most of those cuts cascaded from the national level to the local level. The local councils had very little money. The local councils disproportionately made cuts in the things which had no statutory protection. Services for domestic violence and sexual violence had very little statutory protection. They were new, they weren't embedded properly. These were the ones that were disproportionately cut. We did some analysis which suggested that it was 31% cuts of the local expenditure at local level. The most recent work we have been doing has been on measuring violent crime. That is a subset of violence, that violence which crosses the threshold of a constituted as a crime, using the crime survey for England and Wales. And we have seen that the amount of violent crime has gone up since 2008. And it's been driven by violent crime against women and violent crime perpetrated by domestic perpetrators rather than by strangers. We have a contested methodology that the Office of National Statistics is still investigating the methodology. But if you count all crimes rather than capping them at 5, which is the conventional methodology, then we will see the increase of violent crime since 2008 in the UK. Since the referendum, we've seen an increase of hate crime. This is the National Police Chiefs Council data. This is online recording of hate crime. Hate crime in Britain is normally understood as based on ethnicity and religion. A 5-fold increase in hate crime incidents reported in the period immediately following the vote by the UK to leave the EU. So we have violence at different levels constituted in different ways as part of what's going on. There was fiscal feminism. The fiscal has been significantly contested. It was put on a public agenda through gender budgeting and the Fawcett Society. There were some minor modifications were won, but the main argument was lost. That crisis next cascades into the democratic, and we have seen changes in the extent of support for different political parties across Europe. My Scottish friends are very upset with me positioning them here. But what we have seen is a widening of the political spectrum and the growth of political parties across the whole of the left and the right spectrum, and the parties in the centre disproportionately losing. The Scottish independence vote referendum was narrowly defeated. The British one, as you know, was narrowly succeeded. So we have a political crisis emerging into a crisis further into violence. I'm still sitting inside the EU. So what does this mean for the EU and not merely for Britain and for Brexit? So I sit in a country which is turning upon itself to examine the implications for its own economy and welfare. But what does this mean for the whole of the rest of the European Union and beyond? Does it mean fragmentation, or does it mean ever deeper union? Is this the opportunity, when the Finance Commissioner is no longer coming from the UK, for the rest of the EU to actually change the regulation of finance? Is this the moment that the financial transactions tax and the controls on financial regulation could take place in the European Union? What about fiscal? If we have another round of financial crisis in the EU, we have 3 countries at least where questions of leaving are precipitating major political issues. If we have another round of crisis, what does that mean for ever deeper union versus fragmentation? Would this mean the imposition of the fiscal rules that were imposed upon Greece, the six-pack, extended to all the rest of you in the European Union? The six-pack was a set of directives and regulations in which the EU level took control over the fiscal expenditure of Greece in exchange for providing just enough money for the national government not to go bankrupt. So the financial and fiscal levels were deeply entwined. The fiscal is highly gendered. The fiscal means expenditures on services to stop violence against women, it means childcare, it means health, it means education. Sometimes when the word fiscal sits there, we don't see the gendering of these expenditures. But if the fiscal becomes a site of feminist analysis, then we see the six-pack and the potential extension of the six-pack as it was done in Greece to the rest of the EU as a major restructuring of the gendered fiscal in the EU. So, what next for the EU? The fiscal pressure in some member states is likely to come back. So at the next crisis, will there be this ever deeper union as the 5 presidents sought last summer during the Greek crisis, in which we see simultaneously the pooling of finance and the pooling of the fiscal in such a way that we have a unified financial and fiscal strategy, which I want to argue is gendered. So, what gendered principles should be, will be, might be, could be in that next round of the restructuring of the financial and fiscal architecture of the European Union? Will it embed the principles of gender equality? Or will it embed all of the existing practices of neoliberal cutbacks on welfare states, treating welfare expenditures as marginal, luxurious expenditures which can and could be cut? So where is the feminist analysis of the fiscal at this moment of financial, economic and fiscal crisis in the European Union? And do we have a sufficiently comprehensive gendered analysis of crisis to understand the gendered interconnections between the finance, the economic, and the fiscal, that it is possible to imagine an intellectual and policy agenda in which the regendering of the European Union takes a different trajectory from the one it currently appears to be doing. So I think what we have seen so far in the crisis has been a shift in the form of gender regime from the pre-crisis EU strategy for the gender regime of one from a public gender regime which had a social democratic model of full employment, equality in the workplace, towards a more neoliberal form of public gender regime. We're seeing a change in the strategy of the EU level towards the gender regime in the context of the crisis, such that at the next round of the crisis, we will be seeing even further cutbacks in gendered fiscal expenditures and the further driving of the public gender regime in a neoliberal direction. So potentially there is restructuring. Now, I just want to pause on the question of a democratic crisis. I'm making a distinction between a political crisis and a democratic crisis. A political crisis is when the individual political parties are disintegrating and reforming, which I think is where we currently are in the European Union. And I'm distinguishing that from a democratic crisis, when the democratic procedures themselves are brought into question as a consequence of a turn towards violence. So are we at the point of moving from a political to a democratic crisis that is not merely a crisis for the individual political parties which come and go, but a crisis for democratic forms of governance as we see moves towards violence which will undermine some of those traditional forms of democratic practice. Okay. So we have each stage of the crisis being gendered. I think what we have is a shift in the form of gender regime, not the redomestication of women. I think there are feminist contestations over these transformations, but they've typically been underestimated, not by people in this room, but typically the feminist contestations which have been ongoing in this period haven't had much analysis. We've had some writers indeed claiming that feminism has been co-opted, Fraser, Eisenstein and so forth. But I think more problematic has been the way in which some of the intricacies of our argumentation over intersectionality has led to a lack of visibly named feminist politics, which has contributed, unfortunately, to the lack of visibility of feminism in the contestations over the crisis, a lack of visibility in both the academy and in the real world. So I want to turn to this question of the nature of the feminist interventions and the visibility of those interventions. I think Fraser herself used arguments which used statements which were very ambiguous and led to an interpretation, a populist interpretation of her work as saying that feminism had been co-opted. Her words were actually slightly more careful than that. Neoliberalism resignified a feminist critique of androcentrism, if you can work out what that means. If you were to be positive, you would say it's the neoliberalism that did the resignifying. So all those men in Davos wanted to say women were good for the economy. It wasn't feminists saying Davos was good for women. So if we get the direction and nuance of this, there are plenty of Davos-like economists wanted to say women were good for the economy. That is absolutely not the same as saying that feminists thought that simply incorporation into the economy was a good thing. Feminists have always been much more sophisticated than that. But Fraser has, this kind of language is open to misreading. Eisenstein does the same sorts of things. But I think there's a real dilemma around the language that we have around intersectionality and mainstreaming. So, feminism should be part of the mainstream. We should be having engagement with political projects other than feminist projects in coalitions and alliances. The intersectionality arguments are all that there should be careful attention of the intersection of gender inequality with other forms of inequality, careful intersections of feminist projects with anti-racist politics, class politics. They should all be these really careful, nuanced intersections, coalitions, and alliances. In general, everybody agrees. But in practice, I think there have been some difficult ways in which certain kinds of feminism have lost visibility. And I'm going to give you the example of trade unions. I'm going to say that trade unions are the largest feminist organisations that we have in Europe. And why does almost everybody disagree with me? Typically, what feminists have done is to argue that feminists are inside the trade unions, that Briskin argues that feminists organise within trade unions, or that trade unions are a component of transnational feminism, that's Mogadam. Franz Wen Fono, we've got feminism inside trade unions. So we've got lots of discussions about the intersection of feminists in trade unions. But I want to go one step further and suggest that trade unions have pursued, among other goals, feminist goals. It's not their only goals, but they have pursued feminist goals of equal pay, free choice over the use of one's body, childcare. Typically, trade unions have pursued feminist goals. The gender composition in trade unions in most of Europe is now at least 50% women. Trade unions have opposed the gendered cuts in the welfare state. So why the ambivalence as to whether or not they're feminist? And that depends on the conceptualization of feminism. If you follow identity politics, then typically trade unions would be outside of the category of feminist. But if you work with the concept of feminism as a project, that is to broaden it to include the allies, then trade unions are part of a feminist project. So if we have a definition of feminism as a project rather than only as an identity, then we have the possibility of including the trade unions and making visible the extent to which trade unions have been a significant opponent of the neoliberalisation of women's working lives. Another example, fiscal feminism. We have seen major attempts within gender budgeting groups, women's budgeting groups, to contest the fiscal. We have seen major attempts to contest the cuts, and the trade unions have typically been very significant allies of the women's budget groups in the contestation over the gendered welfare cuts. So I'm discussing here the gendered practices in decision-making and gendered politics, and asking questions about the gender balance in decision-making, gender politics. And this last example here is of gendered governance of finance, to take us back to that starting point of the crisis in finance. Finance caused the crisis. Very particularly, the removal of the democratic controls that we put on finance in 1944 after the 1929 crash were removed in the 1980s during the neoliberal project. So if we're putting back democratic controls over finance, what would gendered democratic controls over finance look like? And we have two major ways in which there is current practice there. One is to change the gender composition of the decision-making in the corporate boards that control the finance companies, quotas on corporate boards. We could extend that to gender balance in decision-making on the governmental committees which regulate finance, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Bank for Settlements. There are a number of international finance. And we could also ask, what does it mean to think about state regulation of finance at a state level? That is, the gendered regulation of finance is a significant part of a gendered response to the crisis. So the gendered dimensions of the restructuring of the European Union's financial and fiscal architecture concern gendered democracy. It's by rethinking the democracy in the European Union that we can rethink the analysis of the last crisis and rethink the next crisis. If the crisis was caused by the removal of democratic controls over finance, and we're seeing the restructuring of the European Union central institutions, what would it mean to think about the gendering of each of those levels? It would mean the gender balance in decision-making in the financial instruments, gender equality in goals of the European Union entities like the European Central Bank. It would mean the techniques such as gender budgeting being a taken for granted part of analysis, a taken for granted part of a women's studies curriculum, that these kinds of techniques. And it would mean rethinking the gendering of the fiscal, that is, to think of tax as a feminist issue and the rethinking of levels of taxation as a gendered and feminist issue, as well as the rethinking of the expenditures. That is, not to focus just on austerity and cuts, but to think also of the raising of the taxation and to think of financial transactions and tax havens as also constituting gendered sites. So, I pull this through to the conclusions then. The crisis is gendered. it is still a crisis. It is still cascading. Nearly 10 years after the financial crisis of 2007, the consequences of the crisis have not yet come to an end. It has cascaded from finance to the real economy. The arguments that the crisis was over when Britons had reached higher levels of employment are not sufficient. We have seen the cascading of the crisis beyond the real economy into the fiscal, with the significant cutbacks in many European countries of gendered expenditures on services to stop violence against women, on childcare, health and education. We have seen very little activity to restructure finance. We have not even seen the separation of retail and casino banking. We have seen very little changing in the democratic control over the financial sector. And we have not seen the regendering of the financial and fiscal institutions. We have seen the cascading of the crisis beyond the real economy and beyond the welfare state into violence. We saw it initially in the contestations on the streets. We saw the violent confrontations in places like Greece. We have seen the violence cascade into the lives of lives of individual people. We have seen the increase of domestic violence. We have seen the increase of violence against women, and we have seen the increase of the perpetration of domestic violent crime. We have seen an increase of hate crime and an increase of crimes, violent crimes and hatred based on ethnicity and religion. We have seen the crisis cascade into the political system. Political parties have come and gone. The traditional parties of the centre have lost much of their popular appeal. And we have seen the growth of parties on the far left and the far right. This has cascaded into a constitutional crisis in several countries, a constitutional crisis in the UK, which means a constitutional crisis in Scotland, a constitutional crisis in the border between the north and the south of Ireland, which will become a hard boundary, a hard border if this continues. That is, some of the settlements of terrorism that we saw will become unsettled as a consequence of the constitutional crises occurring as a consequence of the referendum vote and the consequence of the UK voting to leave the European Union. So we are having constitutional crises between member states and the European Union, and we are seeing the restructuring of the Central European institutions being discussed. It seems to me most apposite that a conference currently on gender and the crisis should be bringing a gender lens to bear on the analysis of all of those different dimensions of the crisis to better understand how we might take forward our analysis in order to contribute the vast expertise in this room to the analysis, the building of the social science basis that's needed in order to address the questions of our day.